I first moved into Maplewood Estates. I thought I'd found the perfect neighborhood. It was quiet, well-kept, and had just the right mix of families and retirees. The streets were lined with manicured lawns, and every mailbox looked identical, painted the same dull beige color that the HOA insisted upon. It all seemed so organized, so peaceful, that I barely gave a second thought to the mention of the Homeowners Association. It wasn't long before I realized that the heart of Maplewood's order wasn't the HOA itself, but its president, a woman named Carol Benson. Everyone knew her. She wasn't hard to spot, always strutting around the neighborhood with her clipboard and phone, ready to remind residents about the rules. Her yard was perfect, her shrubs trimmed into geometric shapes, and she made sure everyone knew it. People joked that Carol didn't just run the HOA. She was the HOA first. She seemed harmless enough. Annoying, sure, but not malicious. She'd leave little notes about trash cans being left out too long or grass being half an inch too tall. Typical HOA stuff. I ignored most of it. But Carol didn't like being ignored. My first warning arrived 3 weeks after I moved in. Apparently, the color of my shutters was non-compliant with the HOA's approved palette. The previous owner had painted them a tasteful forest green, but Carol claimed they needed to be Maplewood moss. I checked the HOA handbook. There was no such color listed. When I brought that up in an email, Carol responded with a vague message about recent updates and insisted I repaint them. I decided to stand my ground. I wasn't about to waste hundreds of dollars because someone didn't like the shade of my shutters. I sent a polite response asking for official documentation. Days later, I came home to find a notice of violation taped to my door. That's when I started hearing stories from other residents. Carol had fined people for all sorts of absurd things. Leaving a garden hose out, planting non-approved flowers, even hanging a wind chime that she claimed was distracting. She had a reputation for targeting new homeowners, testing how far she could push them. Some people fought back. Others gave in just to avoid the hassle. It became clear that Carol thrived on control. The HOA wasn't about keeping the neighborhood nice. It was about keeping her in charge. Things escalated when she began showing up unannounced. I'd find her walking around my front yard, jotting things down on her clipboard. Once, she even stepped onto my porch to take a photo of my address plaque, claiming it was non-standard size. I started feeling uneasy in my own home when I confronted her. Politely, of course. She brushed me off with that smug little smirk she always wore. She said she was documenting violations for record-keeping purposes. I reminded her that trespassing was illegal. She just laughed and said, "Oh, honey, I am the record keeper." Over the next few months, I received more notices. Fines started piling up, small ones at first, but they added up. $50 for unapproved landscaping, $75 for improper trash storage, $100 for failure to repaint shutters within compliance period. None of them were legitimate, but Carol made them look official enough to scare people that I decided to investigate. I attended the next HOA meeting, expecting to find a formal board, a group of neighbors discussing community issues. Instead, it was just Carol and 2 elderly residents who nodded at everything she said. She dominated the meeting like a dictator addressing her subjects, reading off infractions and approving new guidelines that no one had voted on. When I brought up my concerns about due process, she dismissed me entirely. She claimed the HOA's bylaws gave her executive authority to make decisions in the best interest of the community. It was nonsense, of course, but she said it with such confidence that the others just accepted it. I realized that most residents didn't question her because they didn't know their rights. They'd rather pay a small fine than deal with confrontation. Carol thrived on that fear. But she'd made a mistake when she decided to pick on me. One day, I received a thick envelope in the mail. It wasn't from the HOA. It was from the county assessor's office. Inside was a notice stating that property records for my home had been updated to list the Maplewood Estates HOA as the primary point of contact for ownership and maintenance correspondence. It didn't change legal ownership, but it did mean that any property-related bills or notices would automatically be routed to the HOA office first. I was confused. Then it clicked. Carol had done this. She must have filed some kind of update or declaration under the guise of community oversight. It was a paperwork overreach, something she clearly didn't understand the consequences of. That night, I stayed up late researching HOA law. I read every article, every forum post, every horror story. And that's when I found it. A precedent where an HOA president had accidentally assumed financial liability for a property by overstepping their authority on ownership documentation. I couldn't believe my luck. Carol had essentially made herself financially responsible for anything billed to my property that went through the HOA system first. At that point, I could have reported her immediately, but I didn't. Instead, I decided to play the long game. Over the next few weeks, I started receiving utility and maintenance correspondence that was clearly forwarded through the HOA office. I noticed that the HOA was paying them, likely under the assumption that they were standard association expenses. My water bill, my trash collection fee, even a landscaping invoice, all quietly paid. Carol probably thought she was keeping up appearances. For the sake of the HOA's records, I sat back and watched. Each month, more payments went out under her signature. Each one, a little deeper into the trap she'd set for herself. Neighbors began noticing that Carol seemed unusually stressed. Rumors spread that HOA funds were running low. She started sending out emails begging for urgent dues payments and special assessments to cover community costs. But there were no new projects, no repairs, no visible reason for the money drain. Meanwhile, I enjoyed a quiet, stress-free summer. My grass grew tall. My shutters stayed green. And not a single fine showed up on my doorstep. By the time fall arrived, Carol was desperate. I knew it was only a matter of time before she tried something drastic to cover her tracks. And when she finally did, it would be her undoing. By the time September rolled around, Maplewood Estates no longer felt like the pristine, well-oiled neighborhood I'd moved into. The lawns still gleamed under the autumn sun, but there was a tension in the air. Homeowners whispered at the mailbox. The HOA's once-a-month bulletin, usually filled with petty rule reminders and bake sale announcements, was now full of veiled pleas for money. Unexpected maintenance costs, Carol called them. Temporary financial restructuring. No one quite knew what she meant, but the tone was desperate. That I did. My bills, trash collection, water, basic landscaping, had been quietly rerouted and paid for months now. It started small, but each payment came straight from the HOA's bank account. Carol likely hadn't noticed at first. She managed everything through automated payments. But as the HOA's funds dwindled, her perfect little empire began to crack. Still, I knew it wasn't enough to let her run out of money. I needed proof. Proof that she had, through her own arrogance, assumed financial liability for my property. Proof that would hold up when she inevitably tried to blame someone else. So I began building my case. The first step was documentation. I gathered every notice I'd ever received from her. The fines, the violation letters, even the ridiculous mandatory repaint demand. Each had her signature, her title, and her claim of authority. Then I compared those against the public records from the county assessor's office. Sure enough, there it was in black and white. Primary HOA contact, Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association. Attention, Carol Benson, President. To anyone else, it might have looked like a clerical note. But in HOA law, designations like that carried real consequences, especially when financial obligations were concerned. Carol had effectively tied the HOA's administrative liability to my property. Whether she knew it or not, she'd opened the door for every expense tied to that property to fall under her purview. I requested copies of every payment processed under the HOA's general account for the past 6 months. Because HOAs are technically nonprofit associations, their financial records are considered public within the community. Carol couldn't legally refuse my request, though she tried. It took 3 formal written demands, but eventually, she relented, sending me a heavily redacted ledger she probably thought would hide the truth. It didn't. Even with names blacked out, the transaction codes matched the invoices I'd received for my home services. Each one was categorized under community maintenance, and each payment bore her authorization initials. CB. I kept my tone neutral whenever I spoke to her. If she suspected I was onto her, she'd try to cover her tracks. I couldn't let that happen yet. Meanwhile, her public image began to crumble. Residents grew restless. One neighbor complained about rising dues. Another demanded to see where the money was going. When Carol brushed them off, a few homeowners began comparing notes and realized the HOA bank account had been draining fast. The whispers turned into meetings, private ones. People were starting to talk about voting her out. That's when Carol made her next mistake. In a panicked attempt to stabilize the budget, she issued a special assessment fee, a one-time payment every homeowner was required to make. It was steep, $400 per household. She claimed it was for community improvements, but no one had seen any sign of such projects. It was pure damage control, but she made one critical error. She sent the notice through certified mail using the HOA's legal stationery. That meant it became an official document, subject to state association laws. And because she attached a breakdown of supposed expenses, it became a public financial statement. That I took that document straight to my attorney. He was an older man named Richard Grant, the kind who didn't say much but noticed everything. When he looked through the papers, he raised his eyebrows and gave a slow, knowing nod. According to him, Carol's actions constituted unauthorized assumption of fiduciary liability. In simpler terms, she'd made herself personally responsible for the payments tied to my property because she'd filed the ownership designation and approved payments without consent or proper authorization from the board. He explained that, in legal terms, she had blurred the line between the HOA's administrative role and personal property ownership. That meant if the HOA paid my bills, even accidentally, it was Carol's liability, not mine. And worse for her, every homeowner in Maplewood Estates could now hold her accountable for mismanagement of funds. Still, I didn't want to sue. Not yet. A lawsuit would take time, money, and patience. What I wanted was something faster, and far more humiliating. So I waited. As fall turned into early winter, the HOA's financial strain became undeniable. Carol sent out increasingly frantic emails, demanding immediate payments and blaming unforeseen costs. Residents started openly mocking her at meetings. The woman who once strutted through the neighborhood like royalty now avoided eye contact. Her clipboard, once ever present, was nowhere to be seen. Then, one morning in December, a letter arrived. It was addressed to me, but the return address was the HOA office. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a notice of overdue payment for my property taxes. The county had apparently sent it to the HOA by mistake, and Carol had forwarded it to me with a note scrawled at the bottom. Please settle this immediately to avoid penalties. HOA not responsible for individual homeowner taxes. It was almost poetic. The tax bill, still technically linked to the HOA's primary contact designation, had been routed through her once again. I knew she must have panicked when she saw it. This was the final piece I needed. I had now documented evidence of property-related financial correspondence being sent directly to her office, and her own handwritten acknowledgement that the HOA had no right to pay it. That meant she'd recognized the mistake and, by extension, admitted her own previous negligence. That evening, I compiled everything: emails, payment ledgers, the tax notice, even her handwritten note, into a single, detailed packet. I sent copies to the HOA board members, every homeowner in the community, and a local news outlet that occasionally covered property disputes. The fallout was immediate. Within 2 days, the neighborhood was in chaos. People were furious. The ledger showed thousands of dollars of community maintenance spent on unapproved payments. My address was listed multiple times. It didn't take long for everyone to piece it together. Their dues had been paying for someone else's bills, and the president had been the one signing off on it. By the end of the week, the board had called an emergency meeting. For the first time since I'd moved in, the community center was packed. Homeowners crowded into the room, holding copies of the packet I'd sent. Carol stood at the front, pale and shaking, trying to maintain control. But the authority she'd wielded so confidently was gone. Her voice cracked as she tried to explain. She blamed a clerical mix-up. She claimed the payments were accidental, but no one bought it. And when I finally walked in, calm, collected, and carrying the assessor's paperwork that started it all, the room fell silent. Everyone wanted to hear what I had to say. I didn't gloat. I didn't even raise my voice. I simply laid out the facts, the paper trail she'd created, the payments she'd authorized, and the liability she'd assumed by the time I finished, Carol's reign as HOA president was over. But the real twist was yet to come, because removing her from power wasn't enough. The board and the law were about to make her repay everything. After the explosive HOA meeting, Maplewood Estates entered a strange, quiet limbo. For years, Carol Benson had been the face of authority, the self-appointed queen of every lawn, mailbox, and shrub in the neighborhood. But overnight, she was dethroned. The board voted unanimously to remove her as president, though the decision was mostly symbolic. By that point, the community had already turned against her. Neighbors who once nodded politely when she walked by now crossed the street. The same people who used to fear her clipboard now laughed openly about Queen Carol's downfall. But for me, it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about closure and accountability. The HOA board launched a formal internal audit. A third-party accounting firm was brought in to comb through the association's finances. Every transaction, every expense, every note on every check was reviewed. The findings, when they finally came out, were worse than anyone had imagined. Over $12,000 of HOA funds had been spent on miscellaneous maintenance, linked to a single property mine. The invoices matched my utility accounts, landscaping services, and trash collection. Carol's initials were on every authorization line. She hadn't just approved the payments, she'd processed them personally. When the auditors presented their report to the board, there was no more room for excuses. Carol had overstepped her legal authority and used HOA funds for private expenses. It didn't matter that she hadn't realized the consequences of her actions. The law didn't care about intent. The HOA's attorney filed a formal complaint against her, citing misappropriation of community funds and breach of fiduciary duty. It wasn't criminal, at least not yet, but it carried serious financial consequences. Under state law, she was personally liable for any unauthorized expenditures made under her direction. In other words, she owed every cent back. At first, Carol tried to fight it. She claimed it was all an honest mistake, that the county's ownership update had caused confusion. But the board had the documentation to prove otherwise. She had initiated that ownership filing herself. Her signature was on the request. The assessor's office even confirmed it had been submitted directly by Carol Benson, president of Maplewood Estates HOA, using the HOA's letterhead. Her attempt to tighten control over my property had, in the end, transferred liability onto herself. Word spread fast. The local news outlet I'd shared the story with ran a small piece about it. HOA president accused of financial mismanagement in local subdivision. It wasn't front-page material, but it was enough to humiliate her publicly. People from nearby neighborhoods began sharing the story online, and soon it became a local viral sensation. Comments poured in, mocking the HOA tyrant who paid someone else's bills. For a while, I felt bad. She was still my neighbor, after all. But then I remembered how she'd made so many others miserable. Fining retirees over mailbox paint, threatening families with lawsuits over lawn ornaments, and invading people's privacy like she owned the place. The sympathy faded quickly. The HOA board held a follow-up meeting in January to finalize restitution. Carol didn't show up. Instead, her lawyer attended, offering to negotiate a repayment plan. The board refused. They wanted full reimbursement. When he argued that Carol couldn't afford it, one of the board members, an elderly man named Frank, who'd been fined for a birdbath years earlier, said flatly, then she shouldn't have played banker with other people's money. Eventually, Carol agreed to repay the full amount over the next year, with an additional penalty fee for administrative costs. It was a crushing blow. The HOA also issued her an official cease and desist order barring her from serving on any board or committee within the community again. She was stripped of her voting rights for 2 years, and her once flawless front yard became overgrown. It was a strange sight, the woman who once demanded perfection now living amid weeds and wilted hedges. Meanwhile, the rest of the neighborhood began to heal. Without Carol's constant interference, people actually started talking to each other. The board, under new leadership, repealed several of her most absurd rules. Residents were allowed to paint shutters whatever color they wanted, as long as it was tasteful. Garden decorations were no longer visual obstructions. Kids could play in the cul-de-sacs again without being told to reduce noise levels. For the first time, Maplewood Estates felt like a community instead of a dictatorship. As for me, I decided to take one final step to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. With the board's approval, I helped draft a new clause in the HOA's bylaws, requiring at least 3 signatures for any property-related filings or financial transactions. No single person could ever unilaterally assume authority again. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one. Months passed. Life went back to normal, or as normal as it could get. The scandal eventually faded, but Carol never truly recovered from it. Some said she tried selling her house but couldn't find a buyer willing to deal with her reputation. Others said she stayed inside most of the time, avoiding everyone. Her once bustling front porch, where she used to hand out warning slips, now sat empty and silent. Every now and then, I'd see her through the window, watering her dying plants or dragging her trash cans to the curb. She never looked my way and I never waved. There was nothing left to say. Then, one afternoon in early spring, a letter appeared in my mailbox. No return address. No stamps. Just a handwritten envelope, tucked between the bills. Inside was a short note, written in careful cursive. You won. I hope it was worth it. I stood there for a long moment, holding the letter. There was no anger in the handwriting, just exhaustion, maybe even acceptance. Was it worth it? I thought about all the stress she'd caused, the fines, the trespassing, the manipulation. I thought about the neighbors who'd lived in fear of her petty rules. And I thought about how her downfall had brought the community together in a way nothing else could have. Yes, it was worth it in the end. All Carol's power had come from paper, from the forms she filed, the rules she wrote, and the fines she mailed. And in the end, it was paper that destroyed her. The receipts, the signatures, the paper trail she'd created all on her own. She thought she owned my house. She thought she could control me. But in trying to prove it, she ended up paying my bills, and the price for her arrogance. Maplewood Estates never went back to the way it was before. It got better. The lawns were still neat, the houses still uniform, but there was laughter now. Neighbors chatting across fences, kids riding bikes down the street, people helping each other without fear of being fined for it. And as for me, every month when the utility bills arrived in my name again, I couldn't help but smile. They weren't free anymore, but they were mine.